Welcome to Alpha Talks, Danish Fashion. My name is Lynge-Jorlén and I'm the director of Alpha Fashion. This is the second installment, or the Danish leg of the tour, of a series of conversations on Nordic fashion that will happen in Copenhagen, in Stockholm, in Oslo, in Reykjavik, and in Helsinki. The Nordic region has experienced a fashion boom. It has become more self-confident, both in terms of its fashion designers and the culture surrounding fashion, both internally in our respective countries, but also surely in a global, more international context. Each of these talks focuses on the specific fashion and the fashion culture in the specific country. Today we are in Denmark, so we are looking at Danish fashion and its local institutions and people with innovative practices and insights. And as we know, culture is diverse and it's made up of different voices and generations. And in this talk, I use the term Danish fashion quite freely to refer to fashion created in Denmark, regardless of nationality or cultural background, or by Danes who live abroad. But I couldn't be here without my lovely, well-tuned three panelists. At my far left, we have Riegels Melchior, who is an associate professor in European ethnology at the University of Copenhagen. Marie has written extensively on Danish fashion and design history in the 20th and 21st century, including the critically acclaimed two-volume book, Fashion in Denmark Through 400 Years. To my very left, close left, we have Danish designer Louise Bjerregaard, who is the founder and artistic director of the eponymous Paris-based label Louise Bjerregaard. Founded on craftsmanship and obsession with textiles and artistic knitwear, Louise has a strong focus on technical sensibility and upcycling. Central to Louise's practice is uniting art, fashion and subversion and working across the boundaries between couture and ready-to-wear. And in the middle, sandwiched between these two lovely ladies, we have Nørgaard, who is the third generation of a family of retailers and designers of the iconic Danish multi-brand store Nørgaard på Strøget. Mads, I would say, is a Copenhagen culture icon. He is the editor of the Danish Fashion Encyclopedia and the brain behind Nørgaard på Strøget's experimental window exhibitions and live performances. And he's also a supporter of artists and art fairs and museum exhibitions. Right. So what a wonderful panel. So to kick off this conversation, I have shared my questions, of course, with you in advance. But to make this sound very spontaneous, I would like to kick off this conversation by asking you all the same question. If you can share three words that you associate with Danish fashion. Louise?
Innovation and craftsmanship and... Why?
Why, as in question mark, why? Okay, let's get back to that. Mads?
Interesting. I would say Danish fashion, Scandinavian fashion, I would say it's accessible. I mean, it's affordable, you can get to it. It's understandable, you get what it's about, it's easy to understand, and it's wearable, in contrast to other fashion capitals in the world. To keep it short.
And now it's very difficult.
Yeah, I know. We are asking a fashion historian.
There were 6 super well-chosen words. So I might also tap into it's wearable, and it's at times innovative, and but it's also pragmatic in many ways, I would say.
Good words. I think we'll cycle back to them in our conversation. So fashion, regardless of nationality, has always been very closely linked to international trade and new modes of production. And since the 1960s, Danish fashion has been increasingly internationalized. And this includes both what we associate with Danish fashion in a Copenhagen Fashion Week context, which are the brands, the design-led brands that show in Copenhagen, but also the large-scale production brands that we associate with Jutland primarily. Marie, I think this is a good starting point for you. You have written extensively on Danish fashion. And perhaps you could start by giving us a little bit of historical context as to what are the central shifts in the latter part of the 20th century that changed the status of Danish fashion and made it recognized internationally.
Good question. And now, having interest in history can be a long talk, but I should try to do it kind of shortly. Of course, we have to somehow address the Second World War and the Marshall Aid that sort of introduced a strong American support of the Western European nations, including Denmark. And that sort of required that support for the clothing industry, or the manufacturers of clothing in Denmark, that they should upgrade their industry. They should become more export-focused, because they have to be part of all these small wheels in a big system to drive a new economy in Western Europe. And in order to do that, you can't just be a home market industry, you need to be an exporting industry. And in that context, there was a lot of debate in the Danish clothing industry about what is our strategy. And there was a man who was making dresses in Jutland. He said that design should be our strategy. We should focus on design and be more sort of fashion oriented, and sort of turning the whole clothing industry into a fashion industry. And so first we had the Fashion Week, starting up with ladies' fashion in the late 50s, and then men's fashion. We had a men's fashion council trying to learn Danish men to become fashionable and dress for the occasion, shop more, consume better, and they all succeeded. We're all consuming much more than we did. During the 60s, youth fashion was a new target group. Young people had money, and it was interesting to design for the formative years of people, because it's fun to dress up and all that. So that sort of all pushed this strategy of focusing on design, turning the clothing industry into a fashion industry. And then there's a big sort of happening again in the 1990s, and that's globalization, because there we have, suddenly it's not the Marshall Aid and the whole sort of getting Western Europe going. Then we have a different world situation, and the whole market system is much more liberal, and we have a multi-fiber agreement from the 70s, and that is sort of slowly sort of evaporating, and in 2005 it's the end of it, so now it's bilateral trades between countries. So we couldn't hold back Asia, and suddenly everyone needs to compete in a different market, which gives a lot of opportunity, a lot of changes. No more production in Denmark, hardly. Everyone needs to outsource. The industry was really changing from being production-based to be more design, creative, market-oriented. And those sort of big dynamics of the Second World War and the years, post-war years, and then the globalization really changed the circumstances for the Danish fashion industry.
So it's interesting, it's fair to say that the discourse or the term Danish fashion is something that goes way back. It's not just something that is invented in recent years. It's something that was targeted at an international audience since, the 50s onwards.
Yes, since sort of late 50s, yeah. But before that, you would never speak about Danish fashion. That would be sort of on the receiving end. To be Danish fashion, you need to go to Paris fashion or London fashion or all the international. And it was like that for hundreds of years. We were following what was happening outside and then adapting it into sort of the Danish wardrobe as such.
Can I comment on it?
Yes, but I have a specific question for you, and I think it's related because you, Mads, belong to this institutional Copenhagen family that I established, and your father, Jørgen Nørgaard, transformed the family shop into a cutting-edge fashion boutique, Nørgaard på Strøget, which was very much in sync with what happened in the 1960s. And the shop was also the first in Denmark to sell the latest fashions from Paris and London, as Marie was describing, alongside obviously Jørgen's own design. And this is something you yourself have both continued that legacy, but also surely modernized. And a lot has happened on the Danish fashion scene since your father's first innovative steps. What, from your point of view or from your perspective, how would you describe what you witnessed on the Danish fashion scene since the 60s when your father first started?
Which is exactly what I wanted to comment on, because everything you say is exactly true. But from a historical point of view, but I opened my first shop in 1986. Yes, my father opened his first shop in 1959, 1961 on the main pedestrian street with all the impulses from youth revolution, youth rebellion, women's liberation, all this. I opened my first shop in 1986 and I started doing my own collections from the very beginning. Everything you said is true, but seen from the inside, what happened was that we were all showing at Bella Center. We were all showing at this fair in Bella Center. SIF, yeah. Which is still there. And then the guy who was responsible for this is a short version from the insider. A guy named Jan Carlsen who was like doing it, he was sacked and he got so angry that he made another fair. And that was much more heavy fair found in Øksnehallen, which is really nice. It's in the middle of town and you're not in Amager and in this SIF horrible Bella Center building. Sorry, Bella Center. So we youngsters sort of said, yes, we're going to go with him and we're going to do that. And then luckily there was an emerging trend called bohemian fashion, which has nothing to do with like Danish legacy or modernism or anything, something really ethnical and so on. They were suddenly internationally acclaimed and were invited to show at Paris Fashion Week. No Danes had ever done that before, is that correct? I think they were the first ones. And following them, we were all like, it was happening in front of us, and we were part of it because it was Jan Carlsen in front with this fair, and we were all there, and it was Bruns Bazaar and me and Monte Simonsen and Philippe Kay and all, and it was very, when you looked at it, it was aesthetically really different, but it was all accessible, understandable, payable, pragmatic, as you said, very pragmatic. Commercial in that sense, but it was happening in front of us, and globalization. So also, and the fashion world is always looking for a new place. And suddenly, woo, Copenhagen was in fashion, and we were all like, "Whoa, it's happening in front of us!" And at the same time, Noma opens, which was like a revolution in their sense. And at the same time, we started swimming in the harbor, which I think are the two. What is actually the two most important things that happened in Denmark in Copenhagen for the last 20, 25 years. Those two. That's what everybody's talking about, right? That's why everybody comes here. At the same time, so it was like, boo!
And the moment, it seems, has never, ceased. And just looping in you, Louise, because you're also very much happening, but in Paris. And I think it's interesting because you, being a Dane, you're part of a new generation of designers that work globally from the get-go, and you also do things differently, both in terms of moving away from Denmark to establish your label, but also the way that you work with upcycling and aesthetics and systemic change that you're hoping to impact. And so, I know it's a big question, but I think I still would like to know sort of about the values, how you roll, what values is your company based on, and would you say perhaps that those values are informed by your Danish background?
I think to begin with, I never really thought that I needed to have a company founded on some sort of values, because you're just in it as an individual person. That's at least how I got it started. But I think I was very transparent with myself in knowing that if I had to work in fashion, since we're in a climate situation, knowing that we don't need any more fashion. And so if I had to create it as my a way of living, I had to be critical about my own practice, and I had to stay really informed, and I had to come to sort of terms with that. Maybe I'm not the next big superstar, but maybe I can move or play a smaller role in a system where people that comes after me has a different way in, where it's more accessible, because being in Paris, you're up against big players like the LVMH, the Kering, I had a show a month ago during Couture, and it was 4 hours before Christian Dior. So in that sense, it's I think being critical about your own practice and figuring out why you're making fashion, if it's to sell it or if it's to maybe be a part of conversations like this, to look back but also look into the future, how we stay relevant in a shifting landscape like it is now.
But it's interesting because it's a conversation I'm having with a lot of talents and emerging designers. Why start your own? Because it's so damn hard, and it's something that we often advised against. And what made you want to start your own label in this incredibly hard climate?
I actually didn't want to start my own label. I worked for other designers during my academic years, and quickly realized the hardship of it. I tried to apply for a job at Bestseller, and they didn't really want me.
One of the cornerstones Danish design companies in Jutland. Yeah.
And I think I was really trying to go for a solid job and sort of creating a voice in this, but they thought it was too big of a risk because they think more corporate, like they have to rehire if I'm bored after 3 months. So I sort of found my own way and founded my own brand out of a necessity of wanting to be in the industry, but I think it was a very considerate choice once I got into it, and that's also why the clothing I made, it found its way more naturally in Paris than here, because I was insisting for a very long time, and still do, that it should be able to facilitate a communication platform before being commercial. And that's sort of like looking at the furniture industry here. It's very experimental and used to be very experimental and still is, but it's also somehow more rooted in the DNA, where it's like fashion in Paris was the place for me to go if I had to keep this information.
And so rooted in Parisian history as well. Yeah. Just going back to history, because I think that will be our backbone in order to understand what's happening today. Because if we look at the modern history of Danish fashion, Copenhagen has been so central throughout. The dress salons of the 1950s, department stores were all Copenhagen-based. But at the same time, in the 1950s, we also begin to see these large-scale production of fashion is moving away from Denmark to Jutland in the same period, companies that are based on textile and clothing production. So we begin to see, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marie, at the time from the 50s onwards, a cultural differentiation between design-led fashion in Copenhagen and clothing production in Jutland. And Mads, Copenhagen seems so incredibly central to your company and to even you as a person. You've made trilogies of shows and staged films at Christiania and Kunsthal Charlottenborg, cultural institutions in Denmark. The shops are placed on Strøget. How does Copenhagen inform your DNA and the way that you work?
I was born here, and it's always been like the most central in the core of me is like a Copenhagen vibe, whatever that may be. And to me, that is trying to define that it's about an easygoing about life where most things are happening on a bicycle. There's an equality between the genders, between people, and things are not, and there's an equality amongst people also, how do you say, economically. So there's not too many very rich and not too many very poor or not rich. So it has an equality thing to it. It's a very Danish, Scandinavian thing. But I always loved it, and I always loved it to the extent that when I started my business, I named it Mads Nørgaard Copenhagen. I thought, of course, of Mads Nørgaard København, but it was like too many ø's. Nørgaard and ø and all, and so it became too much of it. But at that time, nobody spoke about Copenhagen. It was like really odd to mention Copenhagen. I did it because Helmut Lang in Vienna, he wrote Helmut Lang, Wien, Vienna, and then in Japanese, like the three. And I thought, okay, well, that's really clever.
Good inspiration.
It was really good, and it was really clever, and it was pretty to have the three youth, because it was also inviting. Sorry, and writing it in English is also because it makes it more understandable for others, because the ø and the o and so on are difficult to pronounce. No, so it's for me, it's very much a value-based thing also. No, it's 100% that. And that when I started, nobody wrote it. Now even Sand on Strøget writes Copenhagen, and they never been proud of Copenhagen. It's like really odd that they write that. But it was nothing at the time. But there was an emerge. What I said in the beginning also. There was things were happening. There were parties, weird places. There were exhibitions weird in basements and cellars. There was a lot of energy and creativity. It was like it was happening in front of us. So it was that's that. So that's sort of the same energy I insist on all the time, even though it may not be there all the time. It's goddamn gotta be.
Marie, just going back, I mean, Mads obviously belonging to the Copenhagen brands and that cohort of brands, there still seems to be this dichotomy between the cool Copenhagen fashion scene and the large-scale production brands elsewhere in Denmark. What would you say is the significance, Marie, of this contrast in terms of the value of fashion?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I also think you have to nuance it a little bit. It's very sort of with a broad pencil. You could say, well, there's sort of design-led fashion in Copenhagen, and then there's all production in Jutland and all in Denmark. But of course, it's not like that. It's very mixed, and it's very diverse, and they're all dependent on each other, and there's a lot of connection. And at least, I think it's important just to mention, at least today, there's companies in IKAST that owns a lot of brands. There are historic brands that originate maybe from Copenhagen or maybe from Fyn or other places in Denmark, but now they are owned and technically based in IKAST in Jutland. So it is very sort of diverse as such. But it has also been very beneficial, at least when you look at it historically, that there's been, and naturally fashion being an urban phenomenon, it's the social phenomenon, it's about identity, so it's where people meet, are together, fashion develops and thrives. So it makes sense that in the cities, fashion thrives, and an urban community in a Danish context is in Copenhagen, it's also in Aarhus, and it's also in Aalborg, and it's also in Odense, and it also happens now and again in more market towns around and about in the country. However, Copenhagen is our capital, so it makes sense. That's where the airport is, that's where you come to, and that's where the fashion enters. When they came from abroad, they came to Copenhagen. So there's a good explanation for Copenhagen being a base for the fashion scene. But very important then to give inspiration for the other companies to go to Copenhagen, go to the fashion week. There has been initiatives also to have fashion weeks in Jutland. Historically, actually, they were ahead of Copenhagen in the very beginning. In the late sort of 1940s, it started with the textile fair in Herning, the sort of heart of the textile and clothing production in cluster, we could call it. So it inspires and legitimizes and gives sort of so there is a need for this fashion scene, cool fashion scene somewhere that can benefit to the others and vice versa. Because why we're sitting here talking about Danish fashion is also because there's an economy in the whole Danish fashion industry. And that economy is more or less based in Brande, Horsens, and I think they have their head office now in Aarhus with the bestseller company. And without that sort of economical base, there would not be the same interest and support from sort of government level to a Danish fashion industry, and a sort of media being sort of paying attention to Danish fashion and writing about it and sort of supporting that whole thing. So it all goes together, but there need to be sort of with the cool area and the production and the businesses here and there. So again, going back, it's sort of a little broad, but it could be good for disseminating to understand Danish fashion and its diversity. It's sort of like, well, there's more design-led in Copenhagen area and less of that in the Jutland area, but that is with the broad pencil.
Interesting points. Louise, I would also like to connect you to sort of an idea of history, because, I mean, if we go back in time, knitwear and wool and wool more specifically, obviously, we're part of Jutland and the Nordic region, and we've knitted in Denmark for hundreds of years. And I know that you are very focused on creating a new knitwear discourse within a new wave of practitioners. And there seems to be this merge between both tradition, as we know it, of craft, but also innovation within your work. And so I'm interested in knowing, or can you speak about how heritage crafts and maybe even Nordic ones, how you work with them and even break away from them?
Yes.
Don't keep it short. Please go.
I can keep it super short. I started doing knitwear in 2015, and at that point, I know we have a large knitting history in the Nordic regions, but at that point, it was super embarrassing to knit actually, and to be a knitter, and to even have a knitting machine was not really hot anywhere, and I think that sort of struck a nerve with me, where it's like then it became super hot for me, and I sort of had a field completely to myself to explore and to disrupt, because nobody cared to have an opinion about it. So it's sort of, for me, knitwear was a facilitator to setting my language free, language across textiles, because suddenly I could merge the leather with a wool boucle, and I think then I started to have interns from Finland, from Norway, from Sweden, who has a different approach to the craft. And I think blending sort of regional techniques and forming a language across borders was for me a really strong testament to why I should keep on going. And then COVID came, and then it became sort of, I think it came back into the living rooms of everybody, and I think that for me was the end, sort of the end of my exploration with knitwear, because then suddenly it became a playing field for everyone, which I think is great, because knitwear can facilitate so many things also mentally. But I think now I'm on to experiment in silhouettes instead, and not so much material based. But I think the craft spoke to my Danish heritage, and I think at that time, because of COVID, you had the time to really perfect a craft in an industry that is so fast paced that usually you don't really have that much time unless you're a super independent small brand still in school, or if you're a mega brand somewhere with tons of employees. So I think knitwear and craft in general is a really fun tool to explore and to learn how to break some rules really quickly, because then once you adapt into a fast-paced industry, even like me, I'm only showing one collection a year, I still have to work fast with it, so I need to be super informed about why is this sleeve like this, and why are the stitches like this on the other side, and I think because that's how you reach people and inspire and get inspiration as well.
And you're obviously part of this new generation of designers where the world is your oyster, so to speak. If we go back to the 60s, I know I keep on circling back to the 60s, but it is an interesting decade for what happens in Denmark. We see the first wave of Danish fashion in the sense that it's design-led, with designers including Margit Brandt, Søs Drasbæk, Mugge Kulpin. I can mention a lot more. Then we have another group of designers, let's fast forward to the 80s, Birte Kajran, Ivan Grundahl, Mads Nørgaard, Copenhagen. You founded your label in 86. But the real movement, at least in the sense of a Copenhagen Fashion Week, the one that we know today, Copenhagen or Danish fashion as a branding label, I would say happens in the 90s, as you touched upon, Mads, as well, with Munde plus Simonsen, Bruns Bazaar, Debut Mikkelsen, that all earned the label boho chic, which was kind of a weird thing in the sense that it really broke from the template of how Danish furniture and how Danish design had looked before. But at the time, Copenhagen becomes this burgeoning place, this very happening place for Danish fashion. And I know you've touched both Mads and Marie on this before, but Marie, can you speak more specifically about what happened in the 1990s, other than raves happening in basements, that paved the way for the fashion culture and the system that Copenhagen Fashion Week stands on the shoulders of?
Okay, I shall try and do my best. It's also my formative years in the 90s and living in Copenhagen, moving to Copenhagen. So one have always to be a little critical. Was it really sort of happening, or was it just happening to me? Because first time I was here. But what was, as I said previously, globalization meant a lot for the industry. There was newspaper articles about the end of the Danish fashion industry at that time, because there was this transition from having the production in the country, and then it was outsourced, and then there was. But luckily, as we are still here, the industry didn't stop or was closed down. It continued with new companies that started out on different premises. They were designers that were buying their production outside the country. And that also meant that this bohemian sort of aesthetic that was maybe much driven from another European capital, or not capital, big city, like Antwerp and Dries van Noten and the Antwerp Six. That was a sort of phenomenon created by the fashion media. In sort of a discourse around the Antwerp Six. That sort of came to them because they were buying their production of the designs in India, where there was possibilities of fantastic colors and embroidery and all these sequences that became sort of part of the idea of Danish fashion. Was also this bling bling sort of and not very sort of Danish in an idea of Danishness being sort of a folk and peasant country, and where you're sort of low key and equal, and you're not sort of a lot of colors and a lot of embroidery and a flamboyant way of dressing. But now it was possible to buy that production or buy that craftsmanship. So I think that was quite important for these brands. They were buying their production somewhere where they had other traditions and they could get something great. And that tapped into also the idea of the nomad, the sort of global person that's affluent in many ways and can sort of go here and there and will wear these lovely clothes for different occasions, layers and layers, and that was sort of the idea. And that also fitted into the talk about sort of the Copenhagen on their bike and being a young mom, and then you're at work, and then you're picking up your child, and then you're putting on a shirt and taking off a shirt or whatever to sort of fit in, and you can still bike in your dress and not very practical maybe, but it looks easygoing and is this bohemian lifestyle. And then of course there's also the industry adopting to all these transitions, and we have the change in the fashion week with the big sort of fashion week, the Copenhagen International Fashion Fair in Bella Center, and then, as you told me, Jan Carlsen was driving this new fashion week, a sort of an alternative fashion week. And I think it's an interesting thing when you look back at this history. There's some key persons that are driving, because this is actually quite small. We're a small community, or it's a smaller industry. Jan Carlsen was really instrumental in this process, succeeding, not directly him, but then also in the end of in the late 1990s, there's new sort of fashion media people emerging, coming about, and stylists, and they're sort of creating themselves. And they then become, in the beginning of the new millennium, they become very instrumental. And there we have to mention Eva Kruse, who is sort of interesting when you sort of have the opportunity to look sort of more backwards. You can see amazing that one person actually is always involved in all these things. And so, of course, it's not her doing everything herself, but she's somehow...
She was the key.
She's sort of collecting people around her, and things are happening around her. And she's always fascinated me. She's trained as a chaos pilot, and she was really navigating in this chaos in many ways. And she was part of, and not now mentioning her, but then she also created the Danish Fashion Institute. And I think that is sort of like, when it, in 2005, when that was inaugurated, that is sort of, okay, now we have a new Danish fashion that is sort of taking off. And it was necessary to go through the 90s and all those transitions, and then it took off. And it took off also at a time where the government suddenly started to realize, oh, fashion is interesting, and why is the government suddenly thinking fashion is interesting? And you're sort of like, well, they also have these political science and sociological theories that they know of, cluster theory, experience economy, and things like that. And they had sort of seen, they went to Antwerp to sort of study what is happening in Antwerp. There's a fashion scene in Antwerp. There's the Antwerp 6. And typically when you went to Antwerp before the Antwerp 6, you would go on a guided tour on diamonds or chocolate or beer. But now when you arrived in the late 1990s, you would go on a fashion walk and you would go to a fashion museum. And even the people in the government, they went there and saw, okay, this is interesting. There's a fashion cluster in Antwerp, not in Brussels, but in Antwerp. And there could be a fashion cluster in Copenhagen. That was the vision. And it's going to be the world's 5th fashion center. And we call it, and that was sort of like, can't you count? There's Paris, there's London, there's New York, there's Milan. There's Tokyo, there's Shanghai, and we could continue. When
quite
it's Denmark.
bold.
But that was the vision, and it was, even though it sounded wild, it was quite important for the Danish Fashion Institute, for this whole sort of movement to take off.
Just saying it.
Yeah, just saying the power of wording. But I mean, what you're saying is also, I guess, we're all involved in producing culture, because culture is what we do. It's the practices, it's the norms and the values that we're all engaging in. And Danish fashion, of course, is no exception. It's made up of a whole network of practitioners, designers, manufacturers, educational systems, museums that exhibit fashion, organizations that support and promote fashion. And as a result of all these initiatives, we begin to see this branding of Danish fashion. And I would say even that in more recent years, we have also seen Danish fashion become part of the whole discourse of culture. And Mads, I know that you are very involved in Danish culture, both in terms of cultural projects and also surely artistic projects. But I would also like to understand how you see fashion. How does your involvement in fashion sit within your wider cultural involvement? Or asking another way, is fashion separate or on a par with culture, the way that you see culture?
To me, fashion is a cultural expression alongside other cultural expressions. It's not art, but it can be in dialogue with artistic expressions, and I think that's one point. The other thing is that fashion sometimes get quite flat, and it's only about speed and price and and to me, I'm a pragmatic, and what I do in my brand is pragmatic and commercial. So it's very much about things that are wearable, understandable, and so on. And to avoid that from just being flat, it needs something else, and that else can come from music, from art, from whatever. But it needs some spirit, Geist, into it, because otherwise it's just if you just do it as clothing, it can get a little boring, I think. And the speed and the way it's talked about and so on. So to avoid that, I insist on in my shops and in my collection that we always collaborate with artists, with other designers, whatever it may be, to sort of engage ourselves in other conversations that can lead to hopefully somewhere else. But can I just say about the Danish fashion in the 90s, because now we're laughing a little bit about the bohemian and so on, which is also fair enough when you look at the pictures. But it was at the point, it was a revolution. It was completely new that somewhere in the world you could get something that was not expensive but original design, because usually either things were, if it was inexpensive, it would be copies. If it was expensive, it would be original design. That's what comes out of Paris, London, wherever. But this was original design at fair prices, which is really Danish, which is really Copenhagenish. And that was a revolution in the fashion system. In short, just to understand why all this fuss about Denmark, that was sort of the key into it, that we actually did original design at understandable, at accessible prices, and you could wear it and so on, and you could go on a bike. Whereas in Paris, if you buy original design, you need a chauffeur, you need someone to loan your all these other to sort of keep it going.
Yeah, that's a good point. We all need a chauffeur.
You don't need a chauffeur. You can actually bike, and it's original design, and you can buy it, and you can wear it, and you can wash it in your machine, and it works.
Yeah.
And that was at the time completely, for us, it's logic.
Yeah.
In Denmark, it's like, well, of course, why not?
Very democratic.
It's very democratic and very pragmatic. And that was sort of the key. So to understand why all this fuss, why was everybody looking at Denmark, and then Noma on top of it.
Yeah. And then swimming in the harbour. But you also mentioned before the importance of being, involved in cultural conversation. And Louise, that's something I very much associate with what you do, because you have exhibited your work in exhibitions that are multidisciplinary, because that's also how you work, merging art and culture and fashion. And I'm interested in, perhaps it's a little bit of a weird question, but I mean, what do you feel a responsibility as an emerging designer to be culturally relevant? And if so, how is this something that you consciously think about, your involvement in culture and your impact on the cultural scene?
I think actually it's a difficult question, and it's also an interesting question, because there's a duality of, for me at least, if I think too much culture from the get-go, it's not free enough. So I think first and foremost, clothing can be a reflection of society, of different cultures, of different informations, and I think that's the primary goal for me, to keep it as free as possible, and to sort of transcend the art world as well, where it's like suddenly you remove the subject of the body, and then it becomes something else instead. And I think that informs culture in itself, and I think that is a reflection of the culture as well. And I think I believe that putting yourself somewhere where you allow yourself to be informed and maybe also a little bit vulnerable in what you do, you allow other impressions to enter, and then you sort of, in a very uninformed way, it transforms itself in the chosen media, if that makes sense. Obviously, I cannot speak into certain elements of culture that's happening right now directly, but then my experience is that through my clothing, I can facilitate by other people wearing my clothing, and other people feel an identity through what I do, that it then becomes sort of an extended reflection of culture at large.
And on that note, Louise, Mads, Marie, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on Danish fashion. I think we could have spoken for hours and helped me cast light on Danish fashion. And thank you so much for watching at home as well.